This is clearly a war between NATO and Russia. Zelensky is clearly a paid actor. He's literally a paid actor. He's a proxy for NATO. And there's many in the United States who sees China as the real threat. So when an empire in decline, it sleepwalks into disaster. So there's absolutely no reason for China to help Iran and Russia, but the United States is even trying to allow reasons to do so.
Well, if you look at the declining great power will engage in more wars. One of them, of course, is the Ukraine war. How do you, again, the Europeans will be more dependent on the United States as long as this war goes on. But at the same time, how long can this war really go on? Because at the moment it's escalating quite fast within the format of only being Ukraine. If again, in a few months' time now, Ukraine begins to collapse, and there's, I'm not saying it would happen this winter of 26, but nonetheless, one see huge problems on the front line, the manpower issue. Obviously now they don't have air defenses anymore, and the Russians have decided to retaliate heavily against the NATO escalations and Ukraine escalations by really pummeling Ukrainian cities, and even putting a naval blockade on along its entire Black Sea coast. So it doesn't seem very stable anymore. That is this ideal scenario for the United States and the Europeans, where the front lines would remain somewhat unchanged, and the Ukrainians and Russians would just gradually bleed each other white. This appears to be coming to an end, as we seem to be reaching a breaking point. So how do you see this war progressing? Because it seems too soon for the Europeans to send in their own public. There's no willingness, even some of the most Russophobic countries still don't want to send their own men yet, it seems.
So this is not a war between Ukraine and Russia. If it were a war between Ukraine and Russia, this war wouldn't have started in the first place. Zelensky would have signed a treaty with Russia from day one to avoid conflict. This is clearly a war between NATO and Russia. Zelensky is clearly a paid actor. He's literally a paid actor. He's a proxy for NATO. And you're absolutely right in that the Ukrainian front line, they're exhausted, they're out of manpower, they're very corrupt, the morale is very low. But as long as they keep on getting support from NATO, this war can drag on for a long time. A really worrying development is that a couple weeks ago, there was a Ukrainian drone strike on an Iranian cargo ship transporting goods in the Caspian Sea. The Caspian Sea is actually pretty far from Ukraine, so the Ukrainians went out of their way to attack this ship, and then Zelensky announced it. And I think that a lot of people are saying that his ambition is to draw the Americans into the war in Ukraine by uniting both fronts, right? By showing that Russia and Iran are allies. If you want to defeat Iran, you have to defeat Russia as well. The Americans aren't interested in merging both fronts, so Zelensky had to apologize to the Iranians. But we can imagine that these sort of stunts will continue because NATO is desperate to force the Americans to support this war in Ukraine. And so I think that these strikes in the Caspian Sea, this strike against Iranian interests will continue. I don't think this war will end. I think it's much more likely that this war in Ukraine will merge with the war in Iran. And this contagion, this domino effect, will continue to spread. Another area of contention, another flashpoint in the world is the South China Sea. So Taiwan will always be a flashpoint between Japan and China. And I think that North Korea may enter the battlefield sooner or later. So for the longest time, China was trying to keep aloof from this war in Ukraine and from this war in the Middle East. So China has always kept its distance from this war in Ukraine, and China has been very compliant with American sanctions against Russia. This war in the Middle East directly affects Chinese interests because China gets a lot of oil and energy from the Middle East. And so China was working very hard behind the scenes to seek a diplomatic solution. I don't think the first ceasefire would have happened without Chinese intervention. And I think that China was very insistent on both parties, both the Iranians and Americans, respecting the MOU. One really interesting thing that the Chinese did was cut off oil imports by at least 50%. And the reason why the Chinese did that was to stabilize oil prices, to give Trump the sort of political incentive to seek peace as soon as possible with the Iranians. So the Chinese have done a lot to try to end the war in Iran as soon as possible. But the Americans, what they're doing is they're aggravating China by imposing new tariffs, by sanctioning a lot of Chinese companies, and by encouraging Japan to remilitarize. Right now, there's a quad happening in East Asia: Japan, India, the Philippines, and Australia. And we can imagine that the United States is pulling a lot of strings behind the scenes. So even though China wants to seek an accommodation with the United States seems intent on strangling China. And there's many in the United States who sees China as the real threat. So when an empire in decline, it sleepwalks into disaster. So there's absolutely no reason for China to help Iran and Russia, but the United States is giving China a lot of reasons to do so. So we can expect a lot more points of cooperation between Russia and Iran. Something really interesting to look at is the Arctic route, right? So China has something called the Strait of Malacca dilemma, which is to say that most of Chinese trade passes through the Strait of Malacca. And the Strait of Malacca can be easily closed off. So for the past few years, China has tried to create an Arctic Silk Road, and that is going very well. But it entails direct cooperation with Russia.
Yeah, well, we always see that somehow China is included in all these conflicts. For example, when General Keith Kellogg, he was arguing for why it was such a good idea to fight this war against Russia, he was making the point that, we use Ukrainians to remove Russia, from the chessboard of, major rivals. And this will allow us to focus on China. And at the same time, you have all these US senators and different commentators who make the point that, well, at least as the war goes on in Iran, we're able to cut off the Chinese of important resources. Scott Bessent was making this point as well. So it does seem like China is the ultimate target here. So, well, I did want to ask about the mood in China, because if the Chinese recognize that a key goal of weakening Russia or cutting off key resources from Iran is to harm the Chinese, how do you see that China is preparing for a possibility of a conflict with the United States? Or what are the possible pathways here? Because we can already see a possible World War III being unleashed through the Middle East. We can see it starting perhaps in Europe over this war with Russia, but you see a pathway in Asia as well?
So I think that the major flashpoint in East Asia will be North Korea. And so here's my logic. Right now, China wants to reunify with Taiwan. And this is the major political agenda for China. And but China doesn't want to retake power militarily. That would be a disaster, and it would not end well. China wants to create economic and political leverage in order to reunify with Taiwan. The opposition leader of Taiwan, a woman named Cheng Li-wen, visited China a few months ago, and she was welcomed by President Xi Jinping. And she is very much interested in reunification, and she'll probably win the next general election in Taiwan. So China believes that over time, Taiwan and China would reunify peacefully. And that very much would be the major political triumph for the Communist Party. It would end China's century of humiliation when the Western powers came to divide China up, when they carved China up into different pieces. pieces.
大家好，我是主播周玉琴。很多的朋友告诉我们，选择原版的太阳星全效克菲尔益生菌，它添加有羽衣甘蓝，健康再加分。而有睡眠困扰的朋友们，赶快选择蓝色包装这一款晚安加强版，绝对是更有感。每日克菲尔，时刻美好 ，Good Feel Good。请上快点购为健康下单，而且要记得输入推荐代码，有额外的折扣优惠。太阳星全效克菲尔益生菌基础版、晚安加强版，新包装改版，内容不变，抽取更方便。要吃就吃最好的。